A black nurse returning home after a 14-hour hospital shift, ready to finally rest, finds herself in an unexpected nightmare. When she enters the grocery store to pick up essentials, an employee accuses her of theft without cause, humiliating her in front of a growing crowd. Just moments later, she's confronted by store security. And what happens next shocks everyone. What unfolds afterward sparks a series of events that challenge perceptions and ignite a powerful conversation. Stay tuned. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from and how stories like this resonate with you. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that reveal the truth and inspire change. It all began on what seemed like an ordinary day. Ellery Harper stood motionless in the crowded terminal of Austin Bergstrom International Airport. Her slender frame dwarfed by the sea of bustling travelers. The polished floor reflected hurried footsteps, dragging suitcases, and weary glances. She gripped the handle of her small carry-on tightly, her knuckles pale against her dark skin. She was 16 years old, bald beneath her knit cap, a silent testament to the cancer treatments that had stolen her hair. But not her quiet resolve. The departure board loomed above her like a billboard of fate. New York Flight 726 on time. She felt the weight of the words press against her chest. She was traveling alone this time. Without her father, Judge Harper, always consumed by his courtroom battles, had barely managed a distracted farewell at the curb. "Call me when you land," he'd said, eyes fixed on his phone. A sentence half command, half afterthought. Ellery exhaled deeply, pulling her cap tighter as if it could shield her from the world's gaze. The cap had become her armor, a fragile piece of dignity in a life that offered her few illusions. The chemotherapy had ravaged more than her body. It had carved out a space where childhood once thrived, replacing it with endless questions and stares, the kind that lingered just long enough to remind her of the world's indifference and its cruelty. As she navigated toward the security checkpoint, she noticed the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in the air around her. A mother pulled her child closer, her eyes darting toward Ellery's cap with quiet curiosity. A businessman glanced up from his phone, his eyes flickering with what could have been pity or judgment. In their gazes was something unspoken but heavy, as if they saw not a young girl fighting for her life but an unwelcome reminder of fragility and discomfort. Ellery had learned to endure this silent choreography of glances and whispers. This racialized undercurrent woven into the fabric of everyday life. It was subtle, the way people categorized her, not just as a sick girl but as a sick black girl. Each layer of her identity seemed to amplify her invisibility in a world that refused to make room for her humanity. She reached the gate, clutching her boarding pass, her eyes scanning for a reprieve from the mounting weight of the morning. There it was, seat 1A, first class. Her father's gesture of love, though indirect and transactional, offered her a small sanctuary. The thought of sitting in a spacious seat, away from the chaos of the cabin, was a comfort she desperately needed. The boarding line shuffled forward. Ellery held her ticket out for the flight attendant, a woman in her late 30s with a pristine uniform and an air of authority that bordered on coldness. The woman's name tag gleamed, Becky Simmons. "Welcome aboard," Becky said, her voice professional but clipped. She glanced at the ticket, her eyes darting toward Ellery's face. Then her cap, a subtle flicker of hesitation. A pause so brief it could have been missed, crossed Becky's features before she handed the ticket back. Ellery stepped into the plane, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the narrow aisle. The air inside was warm and heavy, tinged with the stale scent of recirculated air and industrial cleaner. As she reached her seat, she felt a twinge of relief. First class was sparsely populated, with plush seats that seemed worlds apart from the cramped rows behind her. She slid into her seat, her small frame sinking into the leather cushion. But the relief was short-lived. Becky reappeared, her steps measured and deliberate. She loomed over Ellery, her polite smile now replaced with a more practiced, neutral expression. "Miss Harper?" she began, her tone shifting to one of thinly veiled authority. "May I see your ticket again?" Ellery handed it over, her hands trembling slightly. Becky studied the ticket, her brow furrowing. "I'm sorry, but this seat doesn't match your ticket," Becky said, her voice sharp and definitive. "You'll need to move back to economy." Ellery's throat tightened. "There must be a mistake," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "My father booked this seat for me." Becky's eyes flicked back to Ellery's cap. "I'll check with the desk," she said, walking away without further explanation. Ellery sank into her seat, her heart pounding. Around her, she felt the weight of the cabin's gaze. Passengers pretending not to notice but clearly watching. The whispers began, low murmurs barely audible but unmistakable in their intent. When Becky returned, her expression was colder, her words curt. "I'm afraid you'll need to move. We have policies, and premium seating must adhere to certain standards." "What standards?" Ellery asked, her voice breaking slightly. Becky's gaze was steady, but her words were cutting. "Premium passengers are expected to maintain a certain appearance." The words hit like a slap, carrying 1,000 unspoken truths. Ellery's skin flushed, her hand instinctively reaching up to adjust her cap. But Becky's hand was quicker. With a sudden, deliberate motion, Becky pulled the cap away, revealing the synthetic wig beneath. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Ellery froze, the air around her seeming to collapse. Becky's voice lingered, loud enough for all to hear. "Perhaps you should sit where you belong." For a moment, the world stopped. Ellery's chest burned with humiliation, her tears sliding silently down her cheeks. The murmurs grew louder, but no one intervened, no one spoke up, and Ellery, for the first time, felt the unbearable weight of both her illness and her identity. A reminder that in this world, dignity was not always a given. Ellery sat frozen in her seat, her cap discarded on the tray table like evidence of a crime she didn't commit. The hum of the airplane engines droned on, indifferent to her humiliation. Around her, the cabin seemed to shift, passengers adjusting themselves in their seats, their whispers rising and falling like a tide. None dared to meet her eyes for long, and none spoke up in her defense. It was a silence louder than any words, an agreement sealed by avoidance. Becky Simmons, the flight attendant, had retreated down the aisle with an air of finality, her crisp uniform as unyielding as her demeanor. The cabin crew bustled past, their practiced smiles carefully avoiding Ellery's row. To the untrained eye, it was simply an oversight. But to Ellery, it was another brick in the invisible wall that seemed to rise around her wherever she went. The minutes stretched unbearably, each one amplifying the weight of her presence in a space she no longer felt she had a right to occupy. Outside the window, the clouds were a somber gray, mirroring the knot in her stomach. She fumbled with the edges of her wig, trying to straighten it, but her trembling hands betrayed her. "Are you all right?" a voice broke through the tension. Ellery turned to see a woman sitting across the aisle. Her name, according to the small pin on her lapel, was Yvonne Carter. She was middle-aged, with soft brown curls and an expression that hovered between concern and anger. There was a steadiness in her gaze, a quiet defiance that seemed to reach out and anchor Ellery. "I'm fine," Ellery mumbled, though her voice cracked under the weight of the lie. Yvonne leaned closer, her voice low and firm. "No, you're not, and what just happened wasn't fine either." Ellery glanced around nervously, unsure how to respond. Becky's actions had left her exposed, but it was the complicity of those around her that truly stung. People had seen, people had heard, yet no one had moved to help. The absence of their voices spoke volumes, a quiet chorus of indifference that was all too familiar. Yvonne's tone softened. "Listen, I've seen this kind of thing before. People think they can treat you differently just because they assume no one will push back." She gestured subtly toward the rows of passengers. "But they're wrong. You don't have to go through this alone." Ellery's lips parted to respond, but the words tangled in her throat. What could she say? That she had grown accustomed to being stared at, judged, and dismissed? That this wasn't just about her being young, black, or sick, but all of it combined? That she was tired of fighting battles in spaces where she was meant to simply exist? Before she could summon a reply, Becky returned, her polished heels clicking sharply against the aisle. In her hand was a clipboard, her posture brimming with bureaucratic authority. "Miss Harper," Becky said, her tone clipped and professional. "I've spoken to the captain. You'll need to move to a different seat." Ellery blinked, her breath catching. "Why?" she asked, though her voice was barely above a whisper. Becky's smile was thin, almost brittle. "As I said before, this seat doesn't match your ticket. We have other passengers waiting for premium seating." Ellery glanced down at the boarding pass in her hand, the inked letters staring back at her like an accusation. But, it says 1A. She protested weakly, her voice shaking. It's been reassigned, Becky said curtly. Please gather your belongings. Ellery felt her chest tighten, her pulse pounding in her ears. Around her, the cabin fell into a tense silence. Passengers pretending not to listen while leaning just close enough to catch every word. She looked toward Yvonne, whose jaw was set with quiet fury. That's enough, Yvonne said, her voice cutting through the oppressive quiet. This child has done nothing wrong. And you know it. Becky's composure faltered for a fraction of a second, her eyes narrowing. Ma'am, I would appreciate it if you didn't interfere. Quote. And I'd appreciate it if you showed an ounce of compassion. Yvonne snapped, standing now, her presence commanding in the narrow aisle. She has a ticket. She's in her assigned seat. What exactly is the problem here? Becky stiffened, her polished mask cracking. This is airline policy. Yvonne crossed her arms, her voice growing sharper. Is it a policy to humiliate a child? To pull off her hat and announce to the cabin that she doesn't belong? The murmurs around them grew louder. Passengers shifting in their seats. A man 2 rows back cleared his throat, his voice hesitant but firm. She's right. That was uncalled for. Ellery's eyes darted between Becky, Yvonne, and the passengers around her. The tension in the cabin was suffocating. Yet somewhere in the chaos, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected: support. Becky's cheeks flushed, her authority crumbling under the weight of scrutiny. She glanced toward the front of the plane, as though seeking an escape. I'll speak to the captain again, she muttered, retreating hastily down the aisle. Yvonne turned back to Ellery, her expression softening. You don't deserve this, she said quietly. None of it. Ellery nodded, though her throat burned with unshed tears. The storm hadn't passed. It had only begun, but for the first time, she felt a faint hope that she might not weather it alone. Becky's retreat down the aisle left a charged silence in her wake. Ellery sat rigid in her seat, her breath shallow, as though even the act of breathing too loudly might draw more attention to her. The quiet was deceptive, thick with the weight of things unspoken. She could feel the eyes of the passengers around her. Not direct stares, but the kind of side glances that tried to mask judgment as curiosity. It was a quiet betrayal, one she had grown all too accustomed to. Yvonne Carter, seated across the aisle, hadn't returned to her book. Her posture was tense, her arms crossed tightly as though bracing herself for another confrontation. She glanced at Ellery, then at the rows ahead, her expression unreadable but firm. Are you okay? Yvonne asked softly, leaning toward her. Ellery nodded mutely, but her trembling hands betrayed her. The young girl gripped the armrest as though it might anchor her to something solid. Something real. I just don't understand, she whispered. Why does this keep happening? Yvonne hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. The question wasn't new to her. It was a question she had asked herself, again and again, over decades of witnessing similar moments, of standing in spaces that had been built to exclude. But how could she explain to this child that what she had experienced was not an aberration but a reflection of a deeper, insidious truth? It shouldn't, Yvonne said finally, her voice low but steady. But sometimes, people see what they want to see instead of what's real. Ellery blinked at her, the words settling in the air between them like a fragile truce. Before she could respond, Becky reappeared, flanked by another flight attendant, a younger man with an apologetic expression. I'm sorry for the confusion, Miss Harper, the man said quickly, his tone polite but strained. You're welcome to remain in your seat. Becky's face hardened at his words. Though she said nothing, her silence was telling, her disapproval radiating in every stiff movement as she handed back Ellery's boarding pass. Thank you, Ellery murmured, though the words felt hollow. The damage had already been done. As Becky turned to leave, another voice cut through the cabin, sharp and deliberate. Excuse me. An older man in the second row, a retired teacher, by the look of him, with gray hair and kind but resolute eyes, spoke up. He leaned slightly into the aisle, his voice firm. I couldn't help but notice what just happened. That was completely uncalled for. Becky froze, her back stiffening. Sir, I'm not sure what you mean. Quote, I think you know exactly what I mean. The man interrupted, his tone even but cutting. You humiliated this young lady in front of the entire cabin. For what? Because she doesn't fit your idea of what a first-class passenger should look like. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Some passengers turned to look at the man, while others fixed their gazes on Becky. Her composure faltered for a split second before she straightened her posture. Forcing a smile, "I assure you, sir, I was only following procedure." Quote, "Procedure?" the man snapped, his voice rising. "Does your procedure include snatching a cap off someone's head? Or singling out a child who's clearly been through enough already?" Yvonne glanced at Ellery, who stared at the man with wide eyes. The girl's hands were still trembling, but there was something else in her expression now. A flicker of gratitude, of validation. Becky opened her mouth to respond, but another voice joined in from the back of the cabin. "He's right," a woman said. "I saw the whole thing. It was completely unnecessary." The murmur of agreement grew louder. Passengers nodding and whispering to one another. What had been silent complicity was now transforming into something louder, more uncomfortable for Becky. For a moment, Ellery thought Becky might apologize, that she might acknowledge the harm she'd caused. But instead, Becky's face hardened into a mask of professionalism, her tone growing colder. "If anyone has concerns, you're welcome to file a formal complaint with the airline," she said, her words clipped and rehearsed. Then she turned sharply on her heel and walked briskly toward the galley. The tension in the cabin lingered long after Becky's departure. Passengers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of guilt and indignation. Yvonne leaned back in her seat, her arms still crossed. "That's not good enough," she muttered under her breath. Ellery turned to her, her voice hesitant. Do you think it'll matter?" Yvonne met her gaze, her expression softening. "It has to," she said, "because if we let this go, it won't just happen to you. It'll happen to someone else. And then someone else after that." Ellery nodded slowly, the weight of those words settling over her. She didn't know if she believed them. Not yet, but something about the way Yvonne said them made her want to try. The rest of the flight passed in uneasy quiet. Becky did not return to Ellery's row, and the young man who had accompanied her earlier delivered a quiet apology when he brought Ellery a cup of water. But it felt perfunctory, an obligation rather than an act of genuine remorse. As the plane began its descent, Ellery looked out the window at the sprawling city below. The lights of New York glittered like a promise, though whether it was one of hope or more hardship, she couldn't yet tell. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, but in her mind, it was Becky's words that echoed louder than anything else. "Perhaps you should sit where you belong." Where did she belong, really? In this cabin? In this city? In a world that seemed intent on reminding her, at every turn, that she was too much and not enough all at once? The plane touched down with a jolt, the wheels skimming the runway before settling into a steady rhythm. Ellery gripped the armrests tightly, steadying herself against the rush of uncertainty that awaited her on the ground. As the passengers began to disembark, Yvonne leaned toward her one last time. "You're stronger than you think," she said quietly, "and you're not alone in this." Ellery met her gaze, and for the first time that day, she managed a small, tentative smile. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And as she stepped off the plane into the crowded terminal, she carried those words with her like a shield against the world. "You're not alone." The terminal at JFK buzzed with the rhythm of a city that never rested. Voices overlapping, announcements echoing, and the persistent hum of rolling luggage against tiled floors. Ellery Harper moved through the chaos, her head low, her cap once again securely in place. But the weight of the flight clung to her, each step forward feeling like dragging the memory of what had happened behind her. Her father, Judge Terrence Harper, stood waiting near the baggage claim, his sharp suit and polished shoes an emblem of his meticulousness. He spotted Ellery before she saw him, his stern expression softening only slightly as she approached. "Ellery," he called, his deep voice cutting through the noise. She raised a hand in greeting, her smile faint and weary. When she reached him, he gave her a perfunctory hug, his hands lingering awkwardly on her shoulders as if unsure of what to say. "How was the flight?" he asked, his tone neutral, almost absent. Ellery hesitated, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. How could she explain the humiliation she'd endured? The way Becky's words had echoed louder than the engines, louder than the whispers of the passengers? And how could she say any of it without disappointing him? This man who had taught her that dignity was armor and that silence was sometimes the price of survival. "It was fine," she said finally, her voice barely audible. Judge Harper studied her for a moment, his sharp eyes searching for cracks in her composure. But when she offered no further explanation, he nodded curtly and gestured toward the exit. "Let's get going," he said. "You've got an early start tomorrow." The ride to his apartment in Manhattan was quiet, the city's lights streaking past the windows like blurred memories. Ellery sat in the backseat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, while her father worked through emails on his phone. The silence between them was heavy, punctuated only by the occasional sound of notifications or the low hum of the car's engine. It wasn't until they reached the apartment, a sleek, modern space filled with leather furniture and bookshelves lined with law volumes, that her father spoke again. "Ellery," he said, setting his briefcase down by the door. "Are you sure everything was all right on the flight?" She froze, her back to him as she placed her bag on the kitchen counter. There was something in his tone, something she couldn't quite place. It wasn't just curiosity, it was concern, buried beneath the practiced neutrality of a man who had spent his life mastering his emotions. For a moment, she considered telling him about Becky, about the whispers, about the feeling of being stripped bare in front of strangers. But then she thought about how he might respond. Would he get angry? At Becky? At her? Would he tell her to let it go? To focus on the bigger picture? Or worse, would he do nothing at all? "It was fine," she repeated, her voice firmer this time. "Really?" Her father nodded slowly, but the crease in his brow deepened. He didn't press further, retreating to his study with a quiet, "Good night." The next morning, Ellery awoke early, the city still bathed in the soft light of dawn. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. The video Yvonne had recorded sat in her inbox, its thumbnail a frozen snapshot of Becky standing over her with that expression of thinly veiled contempt. Ellery's finger hovered over the play button, but she couldn't bring herself to press it. Seeing it again would mean reliving it, and she wasn't sure she had the strength. Instead, she opened the accompanying email from Yvonne. "Ellery, I wanted to send you this in case you decide to take action. You don't have to do anything with it, but if you ever feel ready, I'll stand by you. You don't deserve what happened to you. And it's important that people know. Take care of yourself. You're stronger than you think. Yvonne." The words lingered in her mind long after she closed the email. What did it mean to take action? And why did it feel like such a monumental thing to do? She thought of her father, his lectures on justice and accountability. But she also thought of his silence when she brushed off his questions the night before. Was justice something you fought for only in the courtroom? Or did it belong in the everyday moments too? And if it did, why did it feel so impossible to claim it for herself? Later that day, Ellery accompanied her father to his office downtown. She sat quietly in the corner while he spoke with a colleague. Their conversation a mix of legal jargon and casual banter. She tried to focus on the book in her lap, but her mind kept drifting back to the flight, to Becky, to the passengers who had watched in silence. During a pause in the conversation, her father glanced over at her. "Ellery," he said, his voice breaking her reverie. "You've been awfully quiet today. Everything okay?" She looked up at him, her father's face a mixture of authority and care. For a moment, she thought about telling him the truth. But then his colleague chimed in. "You must be proud of her. Judge Harper," the man said with a smile. "A girl like that, she must get her strength from you." Ellery's stomach tightened at the words. A girl like that. The phrase was meant as a compliment, but it felt like a judgment. A reminder that she was seen not as a person but as a story. A symbol. She forced a polite smile, but the knot in her chest only grew tighter. That evening, back at the apartment, her father found her sitting on the couch, her knees drawn to her chest. He sat down beside her, the leather creaking under his weight. "Ellery," he began, his tone softer than before. "If something happened, you can tell me. You know that, right?" She hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of her sleeve. "It's just hard," she said finally, "being seen the way people see me. Like I'm not enough, or like I'm too much." Her father's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" She looked at him, her voice trembling but determined. "Like I don't belong. Like I'm either invisible or too visible. Like I have to prove I deserve to be here. All the time." Judge Harper's expression shifted, a flicker of something, recognition, maybe, crossing his face. He leaned back, his hand resting on his chin. For the first time, he didn't have an immediate answer. Instead, he said, "I think you're stronger than you know, Ellery, but I also think you're right. This world isn't always fair. And that's why we fight. Ellery nodded, her chest tightening. She didn't feel strong, not yet, but for the first time, she felt like she didn't have to carry the weight of it alone. The morning sun slanted through the tall windows of Judge Harper's office, casting long, dramatic shadows over the polished wooden desk where Ellery sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across from her, her father leaned back in his chair, the weight of the moment pressing down on the room like an invisible force. "This is bigger than just the flight," he said finally, his tone even but firm. "If we go forward with this, it won't just be about you. It'll be about what your story represents. Are you ready for that kind of attention?" Ellery hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. The idea of her experience being scrutinized by strangers made her stomach churn. But there was a flicker of something stronger beneath the fear. A desire to be seen. Not for her illness or her vulnerability, but for her courage. "I think so," she said quietly, though her voice wavered. Judge Harper nodded, his expression softening. "Good, because this isn't just about justice for you. It's about accountability for everyone like that flight attendant who thinks they can act without consequence. And it's about every person who's been told, in one way or another, that they don't belong." The words hung in the air, heavy with significance. Ellery didn't reply, but the knot in her chest loosened just slightly. For the first time, she felt the edges of her voice forming, waiting for the right moment to emerge. That evening, Yvonne Carter called, her voice steady and encouraging. "Ellery, if you're willing, I think we should take the video public. People need to see what happened." The thought sent a chill down Ellery's spine. The video, she hadn't even watched it herself. And the idea of the world seeing it made her feel exposed in a way she couldn't fully articulate. "Why does it have to be me?" she asked, her voice small. "Because you're the one it happened to," Yvonne replied gently. "And because you have the strength to turn this into something bigger than yourself. But it's your choice. No one can make it for you." Ellery didn't answer right away. She thought about Becky's words, about the passengers who had looked away, and about the feeling of being erased even as all eyes were on her. Slowly, a new kind of resolve began to take shape. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's do it." The video hit the internet the next day, accompanied by a brief statement from Judge Harper. "This is my daughter, Ellery Harper," it began. "What happened to her on Flight 726 is unacceptable. And it's indicative of a deeper problem in our society. A problem we can no longer ignore." The video spread like wildfire, shared and reshared across social media platforms and picked up by news outlets. Comments flooded in, some offering outrage and support, while others were filled with skepticism and venom. "Just another kid looking for attention." One comment read, "Why didn't she speak up on the plane if it was so bad?" said another. The words stung more than Ellery had expected. Even as the public conversation grew, she felt the isolation creeping back in. The world was watching, but it wasn't all kindness and understanding. Some saw her as a symbol, others as a target. A few days later, the first interview request came in, a major news outlet wanting to hear Ellery's story firsthand. Judge Harper reviewed the request carefully, his face unreadable. "It's up to you," he said, sliding the paper across the table. "This is your story. No one can tell it better than you." Ellery stared at the paper, her heart pounding. The idea of sitting in front of a camera, of baring herself to the world, was terrifying. But then she thought of the passengers on the flight, the way they'd stayed silent. If she didn't speak, wasn't she just doing the same? "I'll do it," she said, her voice steadier this time. The interview took place in a quiet studio, the cameras and lights looming large in the small space. Ellery sat stiffly in the chair, her hands gripping the armrests as the host, a polished woman with an empathetic smile, introduced her to the audience. "Ellery Harper is here with us today to share her story," the host began. "It's a story that sparked a national conversation about dignity, accountability, and what it means to truly belong." Ellery swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her ears. When the first question came, "How did you feel in that moment?" the words caught in her throat. But then she saw her father, standing just off camera, his expression steady and encouraging. She took a deep breath. "I felt invisible," she said finally. "Like I didn't matter. Like I wasn't worth the seat I was sitting in." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, recounting the events of the flight. She didn't embellish or dramatize, the truth was enough. And as she spoke, she felt the weight of her silence lifting. replaced by something unfamiliar but welcome. A sense of power. The interview aired that night, drawing millions of viewers. The response was immediate. Messages of support poured in. But so did the backlash. Ellery scrolled through the comments online, her chest tightening as she read the words of strangers who dismissed her as a fraud or accused her of seeking fame. "Don't read them," her father advised, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Focus on the people who stand with you." But it wasn't that simple. The negativity clung to her, a reminder that her fight wasn't just against one flight attendant or one airline. It was against a system that thrived on dismissing voices like hers. Days later, Regency Airlines released a statement. It was carefully worded, apologizing for any distress caused, and promising to review policies to ensure inclusivity. But it stopped short of admitting fault, and it made no mention of Becky Simmons. "That's not enough," Yvonne said when Ellery called her to discuss it. "They're trying to sweep this under the rug." Ellery felt the anger rising in her chest, mingling with her fear. She thought of the people who had doubted her, the voices telling her to stay quiet. And she thought of the passengers who hadn't spoken up, of Becky's cold smile. "It's not enough," Ellery agreed. For the first time, her voice didn't shake. The fight wasn't over, and this time, she was ready to face it head on. The newsroom was a hive of energy when Ellery arrived for her second interview. This time with a prominent national anchor. The show had promised to delve into the systemic issues her story illuminated. Bias, power, and the unspoken ways race still determined who was seen and who was silenced. It wasn't just about what had happened on the flight anymore, it was about the patterns it exposed. Ellery sat in the green room, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her father stood nearby, reviewing talking points with the producer. But she wasn't listening. Instead, her mind drifted to the comments she'd read online that morning. "This is why first class should stay exclusive. She's just playing the race card. People need to stop looking for problems." Her stomach twisted, not from the cruelty of the words. She'd faced worse, but from the quiet acknowledgement that they weren't unique. They were echoes of what she'd felt on the plane. The same underlying belief that people like her didn't belong in certain spaces. That even her father's title and her family's resources weren't enough to shield her from the casual violence of exclusion. "Ellery," her father's voice broke through her thoughts. She looked up to find him watching her, concern etched in his features. "You don't have to do this." But she did, not for herself, but for everyone who had felt the same knot of humiliation and helplessness. For those who had been told, subtly or overtly, that they should know their place. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The interview started smoothly. The anchor was warm, her questions designed to invite thoughtful reflection rather than confrontation. But as the conversation deepened, so did the complexity of the questions. "Ellery," the anchor said, leaning forward slightly, "some critics have suggested that this incident is being blown out of proportion. They argue that a single flight attendant's behavior doesn't represent systemic issues. What do you say to that?" Ellery hesitated, her breath catching. She'd expected the question, but it still felt like a test. A challenge to prove her experience was real and meaningful. "It's not about one flight," she said finally, her words deliberate. "It's about what that flight represents. It's about the way people see you when you don't fit their idea of what belongs. It's about the silence that lets things like this keep happening." The anchor nodded, her expression thoughtful. "So, you believe this is part of a larger issue?" "I know it is," Ellery replied, her voice gaining strength, "because this wasn't the first time I've felt this way. And it won't be the last unless we start talking about it." The interview aired that night, sparking another wave of public reaction. Advocacy groups picked up her words, amplifying her message. But the backlash was louder this time, the criticism sharper. On a major news network, a panel of commentators dissected her story. One, a middle-aged man in a crisp suit, dismissed it outright. "This isn't about race or bias," he argued. "It's about following the rules. We're creating a culture where people can cry discrimination every time they're inconvenienced." Ellery watched the segment from her father's living room, her fists clenching as the commentators continued to debate her experience as if it were an abstract concept. Her father sat beside her, his expression dark. "They don't get it," she muttered, her voice shaking with frustration. "They don't want to get it." Judge Harper sighed, his jaw tightening. "No, they don't, but that doesn't mean you stop." The following day, Regency Airlines announced a press conference. Their statement was vague, promising to address the growing controversy without admitting fault. The press conference took place in a sterile hotel ballroom, with the airline's CEO standing behind a polished podium. "We are committed to ensuring an inclusive and respectful experience for all passengers," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "We deeply regret any distress caused and are reviewing our policies to prevent future incidents." It was a non-apology, a string of corporate platitudes designed to quiet the noise without addressing the root. When reporters pressed him about Becky Simmons, the flight attendant, he deflected. "This is a personnel matter," he said firmly. "I cannot comment further." Ellery and her father watched the broadcast from home, the hollow words echoing in their ears. It felt like another slap. Another reminder of how easily people could brush aside discomfort that wasn't theirs to carry. "This isn't over," Judge Harper said, his voice filled with resolve. "Not even close." The turning point came days later, when a whistleblower, another flight attendant from Regency Airlines, came forward. In an anonymous interview with a major newspaper, they described a culture of bias and favoritism within the company, with multiple instances of discriminatory behavior being swept under the rug. "There's an unspoken understanding," the whistleblower said. "Certain passengers are treated differently, depending on how they look or where they're from, and the company turns a blind eye." The story sent shockwaves through the media. Advocacy groups called for an investigation into Regency Airlines, while social media exploded with calls for boycotts. Hashtags like Ellery Speaks and Accountability now trended nationwide. Ellery sat in stunned silence as the story unfolded, her phone buzzing with messages of support. But even amid the chaos, doubt lingered. "What if it still doesn't change anything?" she asked her father late one night, her voice barely above a whisper. Judge Harper looked at her, his expression steady. "It already has," he said, "because you refused to stay silent. And now the world is listening." Ellery didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. But she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. Hope that her voice, fragile as it had seemed, was part of something larger. Something unstoppable. The morning air was crisp as Ellery Harper stepped onto the courthouse steps, her heart pounding against her ribcage. The crowd gathered below was larger than she had anticipated. Journalists with cameras poised, community leaders holding signs, and ordinary people who had come to show their support. The hum of their voices created a nervous energy that filled the space, a potent reminder of the weight her story now carried. Standing beside her, Judge Harper was a pillar of calm. His hand rested lightly on her shoulder, grounding her, even as the world felt too big and too loud. "They're here for you," he said quietly, "because you had the courage to speak when others couldn't." Ellery nodded, though her throat felt tight. The steps leading up to the podium felt like a mountain, and the microphone waiting for her seemed impossibly far away. She took a deep breath and ascended. "Good morning," Ellery began, her voice quivering but growing steadier with each word. "My name is Ellery Harper, and I never thought I'd be standing here." The crowd fell silent, the weight of her words drawing their focus. "When I boarded that flight, I was just a girl trying to get to her treatment. But what happened to me wasn't just about one flight. It was about something much bigger. It was about how people are seen, or not seen, because of how they look, where they come from, or what they're going through." She paused, her eyes scanning the faces in the crowd. Some were nodding, others wiping away tears. "This isn't just my story," she continued, her voice firmer now. "It's the story of everyone who's been told they don't belong. Everyone who's been judged before they've even spoken. And it's time for that to change." As Ellery stepped back from the podium, the crowd erupted into applause, a sound so overwhelming it brought tears to her eyes. Her father gave her a small nod, his pride clear, even in his reserved demeanor. But not everyone in the crowd was supportive. The backlash began almost immediately. Within hours, social media was ablaze with debates. For every post praising Ellery's bravery, there was another dismissing her as a child manipulated by her father or a privileged teenager making noise for attention. The comments were sharper now, laced with vitriol that cut deeper than the whispers on the plane ever had. "She's not a hero," one comment read. "She's just another spoiled kid who doesn't know how the world works." The words weighed heavily on Ellery, each one a small dagger chipping away at the confidence she had fought so hard to build. She stayed off her phone for the rest of the day, retreating to the quiet of her room as the world continued to argue about her. That evening, a major news network hosted a panel discussion about the incident. The panelists, a mix of journalists, academics, and a former airline executive, debated whether Ellery's story represented systemic issues or an isolated incident. We need to be careful about turning every negative experience into a conversation about race, the executive argued, his tone measured but dismissive. This could have been a misunderstanding. Not every conflict is rooted in bias. A professor, a black woman with a piercing gaze, countered sharply. That's a convenient argument for those who don't live these experiences. She said, incidents like this don't happen in a vacuum. They're part of a larger pattern. A system that teaches people to see certain lives as less deserving of dignity. Ellery watched from the living room, her father sitting beside her. He didn't say much, but his jaw tightened with each dismissive comment. When the segment ended, he turned to her. This is what happens when you challenge the status quo, he said. People will fight to protect the world they're comfortable with, even if it comes at someone else's expense. Ellery nodded, though her chest felt heavy. But how do you keep fighting when it feels like no one wants to listen? Her father's expression softened. You don't fight for the people who won't listen. You fight for the ones who will. The next day brought an unexpected twist. A letter arrived at Judge Harper's office, handwritten and unsigned. Inside was a confession from another flight attendant at Regency Airlines, corroborating the whistleblower's earlier claims. I've worked with Becky Simmons for years. The letter read, she's not the only one with these attitudes, but she's one of the worst. We've all seen how she treats passengers she doesn't think belong in first class. But the company doesn't care. They protect her because it's easier than addressing the real problem. The letter was a turning point. Judge Harper contacted a journalist he trusted. And within days, the story was published. The article exposed a pattern of discriminatory practices at Regency Airlines, bolstered by anonymous testimonies from current and former employees. The public reaction was swift and damning. Advocacy groups demanded an independent investigation, and government officials began calling for hearings. Regency Airlines, once dismissive, was now scrambling to contain the fallout. As the pressure mounted, Becky Simmons was placed on administrative leave. A statement from the airline described her actions as not reflective of company values. But it stopped short of taking full accountability. Ellery read the statement aloud at the dinner table that night, her voice tinged with frustration. They're just trying to save face, she said. Her father nodded. They'll do everything they can to avoid real accountability. That's why we have to keep pushing. But Ellery wasn't sure how much more she could push. The weight of the fight was exhausting, the constant scrutiny wearing her down. That night, she called Yvonne, her voice trembling as she admitted her doubts. I don't know if I can do this anymore, she said. It's too much. Yvonne's response was gentle but firm. Ellery, you don't have to carry this alone. None of us do. That's why we fight together. So the weight doesn't crush any one person. Ellery let the words sink in, the knot in her chest loosening just slightly. Maybe she didn't have to do it all, but she could do her part. As the days turned into weeks, the fight continued. Regency Airlines announced a review of its policies, promising changes that felt more like damage control than genuine reform. But the movement Ellery had sparked refused to fade. Stories poured in from people across the country, each one a testament to the systemic issues she had brought to light. For the first time, Ellery began to see her story not as an ending, but as a beginning, a crack in the foundation of something much larger. And as she stood on the courthouse steps once more, preparing to address the crowd, she realized that the fight wasn't about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And the possibility of a world where those words no longer had power. The air in the packed auditorium was electric. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on the stage, where Ellery Harper stood behind a podium. The backdrop bore the words, "Dignity for all, confronting bias in everyday spaces." The conference, organized by a coalition of civil rights groups and advocacy organizations, had drawn a diverse crowd, policymakers, activists, and everyday people united by a shared desire for change. Ellery's hands rested lightly on the edges of the podium. She could feel their weight. Expectation, hope, scrutiny, pressing against her. But it didn't crush her. Not anymore. She took a deep breath, letting the moment settle before she began. When I first spoke out, she said, her voice clear and steady. "I thought it was just about me. About what happened on that flight. But I've learned that my story isn't unique. It's part of something much bigger." The room was silent, every ear attuned to her words. "Everywhere I've gone, I've heard stories like mine. People excluded, judged, humiliated, not for what they've done, but for who they are. It happens in airports, in schools, in workplaces, and in neighborhoods. And every time, it's like the world is quietly saying, 'You don't belong here.'" Her words landed with weight, the quiet murmur of agreement rippling through the audience. "But here's what I've come to understand," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "The people who say that don't get to decide. Belonging isn't something anyone can give or take away. It's something we claim for ourselves. And for each other." The journey to this moment hadn't been easy. In the weeks leading up to the conference, the backlash against Ellery had reached new heights. Anonymous emails filled with slurs and threats. Social media campaigns accusing her of fabricating her story. Even former employees of Regency Airlines came forward, not to defend her, but to argue that her case was a distraction from the real issues. "Why her?" one pundit sneered during a televised debate. "Why does this teenager get to be the face of systemic change?" Ellery had watched that segment with her father, her chest tight with anger. He had turned off the television mid-sentence, his expression unreadable. "They're afraid," he said quietly. "Of what?" she asked. "Of you," he replied, "because your voice makes them confront things they'd rather ignore." But the fear wasn't just theirs. It was hers, too. There were nights when the weight of it all, the attention, the criticism, the pressure, left her curled up in her bed, wondering if she should have stayed silent, if it was worth it. And then, there were the letters. They came in envelopes addressed to her father's office or through emails forwarded by Yvonne. Letters from strangers across the country. Mothers, fathers, teenagers, elders, thanking her for speaking out, for giving voice to things they had felt but never dared to say. "My son is in a wheelchair," one letter read. "He's been treated like an inconvenience his whole life. Watching you stand up made him believe he can." 2. Those letters reminded her why she had started this journey. They gave her the strength to keep going. As Ellery stood on that stage, she thought about those letters, about the people who had written them and the lives their words represented. "This fight isn't about tearing people down," she said, her tone shifting to one of quiet conviction. "It's about building something better. A world where dignity isn't a privilege but a given. Where we don't just tolerate each other. We see each other, fully and completely." The applause began slowly, like the first drops of rain, and then swelled into a thunderous wave. Ellery stood tall, letting it wash over her. It wasn't validation she sought, but connection, and in that moment, she felt it. In the days that followed the conference, momentum grew. The airline industry, under mounting public pressure, announced sweeping reforms, including mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all employees. Regency Airlines issued a formal apology to Ellery, admitting fault and pledging to do better. But Ellery knew the work was far from over. One apology couldn't undo a system that had been built over centuries. One reform couldn't erase generations of harm. Still, it was a start. Months later, Ellery sat on the floor of her bedroom, surrounded by blueprints and notes. The Bright Hope Foundation, her dream of creating a resource for young people navigating illness and discrimination, was becoming a reality. Her father leaned against the doorway, watching her work with a quiet pride. "You've come a long way," he said. She looked up, smiling faintly. "I had a good teacher." "Don't give me too much credit," he replied. "You've been the teacher in this." Ellery paused, the weight of his words settling over her. She thought about the flight, about Becky Simmons, about the passengers who had stayed silent, and the ones who had spoken, about the thousands of voices that had joined hers since. "I just want to make things better," she said softly. Her father stepped into the room, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You already have." On a rainy afternoon a year later, Ellery returned to Austin Bergstrom International Airport. This time, she wasn't alone. Yvonne walked beside her, carrying a folder of documents for a meeting with the National Board on Transportation Ethics. They were there to push for stronger accountability measures across the industry. As they approached the gate, a young girl in a wheelchair caught sight of Ellery and waved shyly. Her mother leaned down to whisper something, and the girl's face lit up. Ellery waved back, her heart swelling. In that moment, She saw what she hadn't on that first flight. A world beginning to change. Slowly. Unevenly. But undeniably. Because the fight for dignity wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt unseen. And it was far from over. It was just beginning.